side. This is vacancies per unemployed. And you can see that in many countries, you have vacancies per unemployed being two or more, or more than one vacancy per unemployed, sometimes in some countries close to two. And what this means is that basically there will be significant pressures for wages to go up, because, and this might lead to additional pressures on prices. However, in spite of this labor market being very tight, this is one of the most dramatic pictures that we have. This is the true impact of inflation on families' incomes. It's telling you that real wages are falling in virtually every single country around the world. You can see that inflation is leading a decrease in real wages and real incomes, hurting people around the OECD, but not only the OECD, around the world. So one of the big questions is exactly why do we insist and why it's so important that inflation, fighting inflation should be our top priority? This is exactly because of this. It's quite crucial to stop the decrease in real incomes that we've seen in the past few months. This is our projection for global growth. We can see that global growth is projected to slow down, as the Secretary General just mentioned. We expect that next year the world economy will grow about 2.2%. It will rebound a little bit to 2.7% in 24. Remember, this is the first time we have a forecast for 24. But you can see in the columns, it's dominated by the blue. Blue means Asia. You can see the main engine of growth for 22 and 23 and 24 will be the Asian economies. These are the projections, our latest projections. I would like to highlight just two or three things. First of all, you see a lot of red there. The red means that we've been downgraded our forecast since June, since our latest main economic outlook. And you can see that in virtually every single country, we revised down significantly the outlook. So that's why what the Secretary General is saying, that we are facing a more downbeat environment. But on the other hand, we also see that look at the United States and Europe. We are forecasting growth around 0.5% with a bit of a rebound in 24. And also other countries like Japan, about 1.8% next year. But you see also other countries like China, where after they had the lowest growth rate since the 1970s, with the exception of the height of the pandemic, they will recover a little bit. But you can see 24, we expect Chinese growth to be only around 4.1%. You can look at different forecasts, and the Q&A perhaps we can take more questions on individual countries. Another forecast that we make is exactly regarding inflation. We expect that inflation will come down a little bit in 23, while the blue lines or the blue columns is basically inflation in 22, the green is inflation in 23, and the diamonds in 24. What you can see that in virtually every single country, you see a downward trend in inflation, a little bit more in 24 than 23, but what you see is that even in 23, inflation will start coming down, even though it will remain high in some economies around the world. And in 23, in 24, in almost every single country, inflation goes down with one or two exceptions. So let me walk you through the main risks and vulnerabilities that we see about this economic outlook. The first big risk that we would like to highlight is that the energy crisis likely is here to stay. And so what we want to say about this is that we know that, especially in the gas market, but not only, we know that this winter, Europeans and Asians have been preparing for a difficult winter with some challenges regarding the energy market. But we also know that so far, especially in Europe, there's been some demand reduction, about 10%. At the same time, there's been more supplies, diversification of supplies, mostly because of LNG. And so in our scenarios here, we present a scenario, which is the green lines, where the trajectory of the storage levels could be in Europe this winter and the next. I want you to focus on the dotted line, which basically tells you it's a threshold that you don't want to go below, because this is where the IEA thinks that we start having risks of running into energy shortages or at least disruptions. And you can see in our scenario, the green one, we are going to go with lower storage levels, but we are able to avoid major disruptions in Europe. And next winter, probably the same thing. But if we have lower LNG, because, for example, the Chinese economy starts growing more and they start demanding more LNG, which is the orange scenario, then it's possible that we'll start having some issues and some possible disruptions in some countries, both this winter and especially the next. But the most important thing, the most striking scenario is one that we have, for example, a cold winter this year, which is the red scenario. And what you can see, if they have very cold winter this year in Europe and in Asia, very likely storage levels will go below the critical thresholds this year, and likely next year we will not be able to replenish the store. So basically, the storage levels that we need to go through the winter. So this is a big risk going forward, and we would like to highlight it. Another risk associated with energy is that energy prices, even though they've been growing all over the place, you can also see that wholesale prices, which is basically the red columns there in different countries, have been much higher than the retail prices, partly because of policy support and partly because these wholesale prices have not been reflected necessarily into retail prices. So the risk could be that, you know, if these wholesale prices continue to be very high, it's very possible that retail prices might be affected as well. So it's another risk that we highlight. Another one is, we know, and we'll highlight this in terms of policy, that interest rates are rising around the world, and rising interest rates are crucial, in fact, right now to fight inflation. But, you know, we also know that rising interest rates will have additional challenges or pose additional challenges for many families and many firms and also many countries. In this case, we highlight the possibility that especially some families that have variable mortgage rates, they will be facing payments at the end of the month that will be steeper than they were before. And so what this means is that besides having to deal with high energy prices, high food prices, they will likely have to deal also with higher mortgage payments. So many families might run into problems at the end of the month. And the same thing applies to firms. We know that many firms right now, especially highly indebted firms, they are facing high interest payments. And so this means that they'll have higher service debt costs. And so that because of this, it's very likely that it will pose some problems for some of the firms. And the same thing applies for governments. And we would like to highlight especially the low income, the most vulnerable countries that we have around the world. We estimate that nearly 60% of all countries, low-income countries, which is about 70 countries around the world, the poorest of the poor, we are talking about many of them, 60%, or nearly 60%, are either in debt distress or at very high risk of debt distress. So this is a very important development, very dramatic development, and so that's why international cooperation in the next few months might be key to avoid significant financial turbulence and also to avoid some of these countries running into serious troubles going forward. And another risk is related to food security. We know that food security has been an ongoing struggle for many parts of the world, for many for many families around the world. But we also know, and we have plenty of indications, that the rise in food prices due to the war has led to additional problems of food affordability and food security. So we think this is a major risk also going forward. We'd like to end up with a positive risk, as the Secretary General mentioned. If we have just peace for Ukraine and the end of the conflict, what could this entail is exactly that we potentially, we likely will go to the financial conditions that we had before, especially in terms of investment risks. And so we estimated with our general equilibrium model, we estimated what would be the impact of going back to the same financial, the investment risk conditions that we had before the war. And clearly what we say is that this will be a significant boost for confidence, for investment confidence as well, will lead to much better conditions. And so this will be a major positive development for the world economy going forward. So it's a positive risk that we would like to highlight. In terms of policies, first of all, remember, go back to that graph that I mentioned regarding the real wages. You know, we're talking about families all over the world are witnessing their real incomes going down. This is why inflation, fighting inflation, has to continue to be our top priority. So in many countries, monetary policy should continue to tighten. Many countries still have a lot of inflation, so continuing to tighten, I think, is absolutely crucial to be able to defeat inflation. But on the other hand, it's also very important that our fiscal support becomes increasingly targeted and temporary. These graphs are showing you on the left-hand side the fiscal cost that the energy packages so far have had in different countries. And you can see across the world, in many countries, this fiscal cost has been 4, 5, 6% of GDP. Remember, when you spend more in one thing, you have to spend less in others. So spending more on these fiscal costs, that means that you're spending less on other parts of priorities for governments. And on the right-hand side, you're saying, what type of policies do we have regarding policy support, energy support? We have plenty of price support, which is either price caps or decreasing taxes, energy taxes, or other types of price instruments. But we can see that on the right-hand side, both in 23 and 23, our database shows that most of the measures that countries have employed so far have been untargeted and have been mostly price-based. We think that is important going forward, knowing that these packages are fairly expensive, and in order for them not to become unaffordable, remember the energy crisis will stay here for a bit longer, it's very important that fiscal policy increasingly starts being more targeted and temporary. We think this is absolutely key going forward. Another issue that is very important in terms of policy is investing in energy security. On the left-hand side, we have what countries need to do in Europe regarding to get rid of the dependency in Russia. So countries have reduced, and this is a calculation from the IEA, countries have reduced demand, they've brought more LNG, they connected to more pipelines. In fact, now we know that in 2023, several countries are going to bring even more LNG to the market and to build more infrastructure. So countries are doing something in the short run to avoid the main impact that this could have in terms of gas disruption. But in the medium to long term, if we want to have more energy security, we need to invest in the green transition. We need to diversify our energy supplies. This is why it's so important that in the next few years we invest more in grids, we invest more in other forms of power generation, and also invest a lot more in energy efficiency, so that we are able to diversify our energy supplies and we invest in energy security so that we have a safer future for our citizens, for our economies. We also would like to highlight, the Secretary General mentioned this very clearly, one of the positive signs we've seen in the past few months is what you see on the left-hand side, which is an easing of supply chains. So what we saw after the pandemic, a lot of pressures on supply chains, a lot of products that were not flowing very well around the world. You can see that this has been easing. In fact, freight costs have gone down quite significantly. However, if we go back to a situation where you have more protectionism around the world, we calculated, and this is the impact that you see on the right-hand side, if you go back to significant protectionism around the world, this will lead to very serious damage to the world economy, but also individual countries. And we have plenty of examples there, from Southeast Asia to Australia and New Zealand, Europe, United States. Everybody would be affected. So keeping markets open, we think it is absolutely essential. But besides monetary, fiscal, energy, and keeping markets open, we think it is also very important to go back to the structural policies in the next few years. And in particular, we think we've highlighted in this outlook two structural policies that we think that is very important. First, reduce gender imbalances. And what do you mean by this? When you think about boosting the potential of the economy, you have many countries in which not many women or not enough women participate in the labor market. So this is reducing the potential output of these economies. And so decreasing these gender balances, making sure that you are able to have policies and programs like we've seen recently in Japan and other countries to target, to bring more women to the labor force. We think this is very, very important. So reducing gender gaps, reducing gender imbalances is going to be very important to boost outputs and to make growth work for everybody. But on the other hand, and finally, I would like to highlight something that also is a highlight from the pandemic. One of the most dramatic impacts of the pandemic was the closing of the schools all over the world. In certain countries, schools were closed by a year and a half, 2 years. And so there was a lot of human capital that was lost. And so as a consequence, we think that it's very important to invest in human capital, invest in our sons and daughters' education even further, to try to recover that human capital that was lost, at the same time that we are able to, and we should, reinforce skills. If you remember, I told you before that labor markets have been very tight. We had labor shortages in many countries. We're missing not only IT workers, but also construction, hospitality workers, and many other types of workers that we don't have enough. So a lot of countries are trying to change their immigration policies or doing something to bring more people to the labor force. one thing that you need to do for sure to relieve from these labor shortages is to invest in skills. So a big priority should be exactly to invest in skills going forward so that we deal with the crisis. So let me just wrap up very quickly. So remember, at this juncture that we're facing a very challenging environment, governments should work not only in the short run, so with good monetary policies, good fiscal policies, but also it's time to make sure that markets continue to be open, we invest in energy security, and also go back to structural. Invest in skills, reduce gender imbalances, and do all these policies that you need in order to boost growth and making growth work for all. Thank you.
Alvaro, thank you very much for that, Secretary General. We'll now move to questions, see if there's anyone here in the room. We have here. Please introduce yourself before asking your question.
Can I put in French? Yeah.
French is okay.
Angel Calvo de l'Agence espagnole de presse EFE. Deux petites questions. L'une concerne l'Espagne. Vous prévoyez une inflation moins importante que dans la plupart des pays de l'OCDE, du G20 et de la zone euro pour cette année et pour l'année prochaine. Mais par contre, pour 2024, vous ne prévoyez pas de baisse de l'inflation en Espagne. Quel est le problème? Est-ce que c'est aussi la raison pour laquelle vous ne prévoyez pas une récupération très importante pour l'économie espagnole en 2024? Et puis, une autre question concerne la Russie. Implicitement, vous reconnaissez que les systèmes de sanctions occidentales n'ont pas fonctionné dans la mesure que vous prévoyiez originellement. La révision de la Russie, je crois, c'est la plus importante pour tous les pays du G20. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire sur ce qui n'a pas marché? Est-ce que la Russie a réussi à contourner les sanctions parce qu'elle vend à d'autres pays qui n'ont pas participé à ces sanctions? Est-ce que les sanctions étaient mal conçues? Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire sur cela? Merci.
So, I might make some opening remarks and then hand over to Alvaro. So inflation is actually currently decreasing in Spain. It was 7.3% in October compared to 10.7% in July. And we do expect it to continue to decrease over the coming months, mainly due to the base effects of past increases in energy prices. At the same time, though, core inflation is building up and is expected to remain high in 2024. We're also assuming a gradual phase-out in 2024 of the exceptional tax cuts which have mitigated the rise in inflation, which included VAT cuts on electricity and gas. In terms of the economic growth outlook, activity has proved rather resilient in Spain in the recent past, plus 2% in the plus 0.2% in Q3 in the third quarter of 2022 after 1.5% in the second quarter, and GDP growth is in fact expected to reach 4.7% for the whole year. And you know, Spain, one of the factors in Spain is that Spain is and has been less dependent on Russian gas imports, and that certainly has been a factor. And government measures and a significant investment of European funds will also help to cushion some of the impact of the war in Ukraine. In terms of Russia, Russia is facing a very severe recession, about 10% over 2 years. You know, clearly, I mean, in terms of the data, you know, obviously it is, you know, there is a qualifier there in terms of the reliability of some of the data, and there is some uncertainty in terms of the speed with which sanctions do take effect. But what we see is that sanctions are having a drastic effect, and a 10% reduction in output is massive. I mean, nobody should underestimate the significance of a 10% contraction in economic output. But Alvaro.
Thank you very much, Secretary. I just want to highlight two things. Secretary General already mentioned almost all the points that we needed to highlight regarding Spain. I just want to highlight something that we're talking about a very healthy rebound in 24, right, with 1.4% growth rate, which will be one of the highest growth rates that we'll see in Europe. So, as the Secretary General says, that we think that we feel very, I think it's going in the right direction. Secondly, regarding sanctions, I just want to highlight something that is important as well. Secretary General mentioned everything that I need to say. Remember, some of the sanctions are not even in place. So we're talking about a massive reduction in their output already, and some of the sanctions will enter into effect only in the next few months. So this will add to the pressure.
I think we'll move to a question from journalists who are watching us online. We have one from William Horriban from Bloomberg. He asks, your forecasts for the G7 economies show the UK will have the weakest growth in the next 2 years, with only 0.2% growth in 2024, contraction in 2023. What are the reasons for this underperformance, and how much of this can be attributed to Brexit?
Well, I would like to highlight our forecasts. The trajectory of our forecast is slightly different from what we see from the OBR, but it's just the trajectory. If you look at the magnitude of what we are forecasting the next 2 years, is basically the same. The OBR is projecting a peak inflation a bit higher than we do, and because of that, we also think that interest rates will go up by a bit less than they estimated. On the other hand, also, we are forecasting a recession that will be less pronounced next year, but then, you know, this will be spread to the part of the 24. You'll see last part of 24 will be a stronger recovery. But I think it's just the trajectory that is different between what the OBR is expecting for next year and the following. And this has to do partly with our assumptions about interest rates, but also how we see the peak in inflation and what's the impact for consumption and investment. Obviously, in many parts of the world, right now investment is being affected, and the UK is no exception. Regarding the impact of Brexit, I think right now, listen, we had, after the referendum, we had once-in-a-century pandemic. We had the largest energy crisis in the last 50 years. It's very difficult to distinguish between these impacts from Brexit itself. So I think that would be the prudent way to say it at this stage. Certainly, we'll look more into this in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. We have a question that's been posed by a few different journalists who are watching online. It's a bit of a general question, but their question is, you don't seem to be predicting a recession. Others are. Why is that the case?
Well, we're not predicting a recession, but we are certainly projecting a period of pronounced weakness, which started in the second quarter of 2022. And I mean, the growth that we are forecasting at the global level is very low growth. And we're also making very clear that the risks are tilted to the downside. And I've gone through some of those risks in my presentation. But certainly it is true, we're not predicting a global recession. We are predicting positive global growth throughout 2023 and 2024, both in absolute and per capita terms. But you know, this is a very, very challenging outlook, and I don't think that anyone will take great comfort from a projection of 2.2% global growth in 2022. Alvaro.
I think the only thing that I would like to add is individual economies. It is true that you look at the United States and Europe, we are not projecting a recession, even though there will be some negative quarters in the next few months. We are going to have some mild contractions in a few countries, but globally, neither in Europe, the United States, or Asia, we are not projecting a recession. As the Secretary General mentioned very clearly, risks have risen, but right now we feel very confident with our forecast.
Well, I should have added. I mean, while there are very strong negative forces that are depressing global economic activity, there are actually also a number of important mitigating factors. I mean, many households and firms still have accumulated savings. from the initial phase of the pandemic, and that certainly provides some scope for maintaining private spending. And in addition, I mean, many governments are providing very substantial supports to households and to firms that are hit by high energy prices. And there are other very significant policy measures that are being taken to boost investment, notably by the European Union through Next Generation EU and also the US through the Inflation Reduction Act. So looking at all of it together, it continues to be a very challenging outlook. We are forecasting slower and lower global growth, but at this point we're certainly not projecting a recession.
Sticking with questions coming from journalists online, we have one from Liz Alderman from the New York Times. How significant do you think demand for higher wages to keep up with rising food and energy prices will become, especially in Europe? What are the risks of new yellow vest-style protests over the rising cost of living breaking out in various European countries if we have a hard winter?
Well, I mean, there is a risk in the context of sustained high inflation that this will also feed into sustained higher wage expectations. And, you know, of course, I mean, you know, in this context, there is a difficult balancing act to be undertaken in the way that is managed by governments, employers, social partners, and it's going to be important to work through this sensibly, you know, including and in particular through positive and constructive social dialogue to ensure that the cost burden of the crisis that we are currently going through is appropriately shared. Alvaro.
I think that's perfect.
Liz actually had a follow-up, a second question. What risks do you see in the two-speed growth rates that are emerging between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the Baltic states?
Well, I think right now we are the two-speed growth has happened over many years. Right now, I think what matters is that several countries, especially in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, are facing with significant inflation, and this certainly will dampen consumption and investment. That's why we go back to the story that is very important to be able to fight inflation and to control inflation as soon as we can, so that we are able not only to have low impacts on real incomes, but also on performance. I think right now, both in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, one of the big concerns is certainly energy, and that's why we've been insisting that it's very important that for Europe there is cooperation regarding energy policies, not only in the short run, but also talk about and think about energy reform going forward, because this will matter quite a lot for the performance and competitiveness, both in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So I think energy, good, sensible policies, leaving markets open, and especially go back to structural policies to boost growth for all. I think this is quite important going forward.
Question from Paolo Levi from the Italian national press agency ANSA. Paolo asks, today the Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has presented the Italian budget for next year. What's your suggestion to the new Italian government given the forecasts that you've put out today? Well, I think most important thing for Italy is right now, we are forecasting, by the way, for Italy, we are forecasting about 0.2% growth, and we are forecasting also that growth will rebound in 24. So we believe that the policies that are being implemented right now will start having also an impact going forward, and so we believe that there will be a rebound in the Italian economy. Going back to what we've been saying about Italy for a few years, the most important thing for Italy is, first of all, fiscal prudence, because obviously that has been fairly high, and so we think it is important to keep fiscal prudence. At the same time that you're able to go back and to undertake some structural reforms that are important, and they've been plaguing the Italian economy for a while. Obviously for Italy, like many other countries, but for Italy, energy policy is going to be important. So I think the government announced some energy packages to support the most vulnerable. I think we welcome that, and we look forward to see the details of the proposal.
I should say, I mean, Italy has been quite successful in response to the energy crisis in sourcing energy supplies from other suppliers to make up for the challenges posed by significant reliance on Russian gas. And we would certainly encourage the government to continue down that path of achieving full energy independence from Russia.
We have a question that's come up from several journalists online being put in different ways, but it's essentially given the recommendations that you're making to governments, are central banks perhaps raising interest rates too fast?
No. I mean, the fight against inflation is extremely important. We need to get inflation under control. Inflation is hurting households, it's hurting real people, and this is a crucial priority. Not only do central banks need to do what needs to be done in order to get inflation under control. Our key message here today, as it has been for the last few months, is that fiscal policy needs to also be well calibrated in order not to add to inflation and to be well aligned with monetary policy objectives at this point.
I just want to give one example. One of the examples that we highlight in our general assessment is Brazil. Brazil faced some rising prices earlier than almost anybody else, and their central bank decided to act very decisively. And it's paying off. You can see that inflation is coming down fairly steadily. And this is mostly because of Brazil's history. You know, they know what is to have inflation lingering for too long. They know what is to have macroeconomic instability. That's why they've been so decisive, and it's paying off. The latest numbers for the United States, I think, is also a positive one. And we expect that with this decisive monetary policy that we think that should continue, we'll start seeing the fruits of this policy fairly soon.
The question from, excuse me if I massacre your name, Tuleto Zwane from Business Day in South Africa. South Africa is currently the only African member of the G20. How does it fare to the rest of the G20 countries in terms of growth and performance, and what are the main concerns you see facing the country?
Well, I mean, the OECD is more optimistic, certainly, than the National Treasury and the Reserve Bank regarding private investment growth in South Africa in 22-23. Private investment does yet have to recover to pre-pandemic levels, and so far its growth rate, though, has continued to increase despite tighter global financial conditions. We project in this outlook that this will continue at the end of 2022 and into 2023. In fact, that there's a large stock of obsolete capital to be replaced, including in the energy sector, which will draw the level of investment that will help provide support. In addition, at the current inflation levels, real interest rates remain positive, which is also a factor that we have taken into account. The commodity boom and elevated inflation have also led to higher tax revenues for South Africa, which, higher tax revenues than expected, and a larger primary surplus than initially planned, which gives some temporary fiscal space to continue supporting the most vulnerable, and also the OECD welcomes the announced extension of the SRD grant.
If I just want to add a little bit on energy, because energy is a big issue in South Africa for many years, and it's crucial to continue and to implement the SOE reforms that the government is trying to implement, but also to invest more in the energy sector, because we know that the energy blackouts have been plaguing the South African economy for many years. And so if we're talking about the energy crisis right now, well, this is an issue that has been affecting the South African economy for several years. So it's very important and crucial to invest more in the grids and infrastructure so that there's more reliable energy supplies also in South Africa.
Final question from the web. Boris Camberling from Agence France Presse asks, for France, and more generally, do you think the policies that are being put in place next year are targeted enough?
Well, our general point is, and I think there's a pretty dramatic graph in the presentation that Alvaro made. The general answer is no. Fiscal support measures are not targeted enough, which is why we're saying they could and should be better targeted. I guess it's one thing to respond to the initial shock, and of course there is a need for speed, and there is a need to help stabilize things quickly. But now that it is becoming clear that the challenging situation is going to be more sustained, to keep non-targeted measures in place on a prolonged period will obviously be very expensive, and it will also entrench distortions in terms of impacts on consumer behavior, investment behavior, and so on, that would not be entirely desirable. I mean, when it comes to energy in particular, it would be much better if fiscal support working to cushion the impact on vulnerable was managed at the income support side of the equation rather than at the price support side of the equation. I mean, inevitably, price support has more blanket application. It goes to many people and firms that perhaps do not need it to the same extent as others. And the question really, in the context of tight fiscal conditions, is whether that is the most appropriate use of resources. And indeed, there are these undesirable distortionary effects that will become more pronounced over time the longer non-targeted measures of this nature are in place. So our message in the broad to everyone is to really focus on making an effort to make this support more targeted into the future. Thank you.
With that, I think we'll close the press conference. Please be aware all the information is available online at the website oecd.org/economic-outlook. Secretary General, thank you very much. Alvaro, thank you. And all of you watching, have a nice day.